Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Navigating the Intersections of Spirituality and Queer Identity in Human Practice. My name is Andre Adipolo. I am the Student Activities Coordinator and Coordinator of the Social Work Student Alliance at Wayne State Social Work. I'm also an Academic Services Officer. I'm really excited everybody could be here this afternoon to have this super important conversation about the intersections of spirituality and queer identity and sexuality. Before we get started, I'd just like to repeat some quick housekeeping business. Please mute yourself throughout the program and direct all questions as they come to the chat. Feel free to say hello in the chat as well. We also would like to thank Wayne State School of Social Work, the Deans of Students Office, and all of our panelists for being here this afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and kick us off to introduce our topic for this evening. We are here to discuss the intersections of social identity. When discussing social identity, there's bound to be tough conversations. In our helping professions, though, such as social work, we must use these challenging moments to self-reflect and learn from one another. It's one of the things we're here to do today. Put the identities of religious spirituality and queerness in conversation with each other, as they should be done more often. First, want to thank our leaders of the Social Work Queer Alliance, Kristen and Tina, for all of their hard work helping to organize this event. It is so exciting to see young people and young social workers carry on the good work and the cause that we're here to advance. Today, the Social Work Queer Alliance has assembled a diverse panel of activists and scholars to elaborate on how these two ideas present and contradict each other, how they interact. And before we introduce our panelists, I'd like to introduce our wonderful moderator for the evening, Dr. Kess Ballantyne. Dr. Kess Ballantyne is an associate professor of social work at Wayne State University. Her research works to inform policy and practice to pursue social justice for underpaid working people and their families who experience oppression along lines of race, gender, and class. She currently serves on the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies Advisory Board and is also the faculty liaison for RAD Social Workers, a student group examining and implementing critical feminist and abolitionist social work perspectives. She also teaches social justice and policy courses, which makes her a great fit to be moderator tonight. Dr. Ballantyne identifies as queer and has closely examined the issues of today's panel, as she is a former Catholic herself and has many family members and friends who have worked to navigate the issues we are going to be discussing today. It's also University Pride Week, so we're excited to be doing this then. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get all the rest of our Zoom situated, hand it off to Dr. Ballantyne to introduce our panelists. Dr. Ballantyne.
Thank you, Andre. I'll let you flip us. So I want to thank everyone for being here. We're very excited. This is going to be an interesting conversation. So I just want to introduce our wonderful panelists. So we're going to, Daniel Horrigan is a proud graduate of Wayne State University's MSW program. Dan serves as the coordinator for the Hannan Center's mental health program, where he is committed to empowering and celebrating the lives of Detroit's older community. Dan is the co-host and co-creator of the Gay with a Bible podcast, a queer social work informed examination of the Holy Bible. Dan is a member of the First Unitarian Universalist Choice Church of Detroit. Welcome, Dan. Rachel Soulier graduated from Wayne State University's School of Social Work in 2018. Since graduation, Rachel has worked as a clinical social worker in both nonprofit and private practice settings, with a focus on providing supportive and affirming therapeutic care for LGBTQ+ individuals. Rachel is the co-host and co-creator of the Gay with a Bible podcast, a queer secular social work informed examination with the Bible with Dan. We'd like to welcome Pastor Roland Stringfellow. Reverend Dr. Roland Stringfellow is the senior pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church of Detroit, and also works with congregations on LGBTQ inclusion as the Director of Ministerial Outreach for the African American Roundtable, a program of the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion on the campus of the Pacific School of Religion. Reverend Dr. Stringfellow has been consulted by media outlets regarding his work on marriage equality and religious liberty and the role of people of color and communities of faith play in this national debate. I'd like to next welcome Ren Jitan. Ren is a queer Muslim who is passionate about building spiritual community. Ren likes to spend her free time doing gay activities like rollerblading and hanging out with her fiance and their 2 cats, to name a few. She also hosts a live show on TikTok, which I'll admit I didn't know was a thing, called All My Friends, where she features marginalized voices, stories, and talents. Her dream is to host a variety show from space. But for now, she is a marketing professional who spends her time synthesizing her experiences into silly TikTok videos. And finally, my colleague, Professor Mark Sada. Mark Sada is an assistant professor of philosophy at Wayne State University. His academic interests include epistemology, philosophy of religion, and the philosophical rationales grounding First Amendment freedoms, including the freedom of religion. And his experiences as a queer person raised in a religious community have helped him understand the need for cultural reflection on the relationship between religion and queer identity. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here today. So we're going to actually just go ahead and start with the first question. So all of you have studied and practiced religion in some capacity while also being part of and or allied with the LGBTQ+ community. So how has studying religion helped you understand the world and conceptualize LGBTQ+ issues? I'm just going to start with Rachel.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. Super excited to be here and answer this question, because this is kind of one of the main reasons that Dan and I started the podcast that we do called Gay with a Bible. If you're not familiar, Dan and I are both, Dan, I am not religious at all. I grew up Lutheran and then kind of fell away from the church after just not really feeling like a part of it and not really understanding or really believing in the concepts in it. And then we were working with populations that, in clinical social work are using the Bible as a way to cope and talking about it in session. So Dan came up with the idea to, hey, I'm going to start reading the Bible. I'm going to try and figure out what this is all about, and invited me to join. And doing this project and actually reading the Bible from all the way from Genesis through as far as we can get has really been a great way of building empathy for people that believe in the Bible and that use that as a coping strategy. And we're just learning and really just kind of discovering it as we go and how people use this to cope. It comes up pretty frequently in session. So I think that's been one way of taking something that I didn't really understand before and trying to create empathy there.
Thanks, Rachel. Since we're on Gay with the Bible, Dan, do you want to jump in and tell a little bit more about the creation of the podcast and what you all have learned?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a queer social worker. Those are 3 words, I guess, that are a really big part of my identity and parts of my identity that I'm really, really proud of. I'm also, I was raised Catholic. I'm a Unitarian Universalist, which are another 2 words that are an important part of my identity. And if you look at the principles of Unitarian Universalism, and then you also look at the social work code of ethics, you're going to find in places like word for word, it's going to say the same thing. It's going to say the same thing in a lot of spots, word for word. So they complement each other really well. I work primarily and have for a few years now in Detroit with the older adult population. So I am working predominantly with the older adult Black community in Detroit. Faith is a huge part of their experience. It's a huge part of their coping mechanisms. And I have a duty as both a social worker and a Unitarian Universalist to understand people's faith and to honor it and be curious about it. But I have found that I've had some real disconnects. I have found that I've had moments where I really didn't understand. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to try and understand. And I guess I'm just going to go back to the source of it all, and go with the Bible. And so Rachel and I, we are on Exodus. One season was Genesis. This season is Exodus. We're just taking it bit by bit. And overall, I think that chapters really speak, where I can find moments and I can find chapters and I say, oh, okay, this really sounds like what I'm hearing in practice. So I really connect more now with where it's coming from. As Rachel said, it builds a greater empathy. And we're just touching we're just at the beginning though. So there's so much more to go. So talk to me in like 5 more years and I'll have more info for you.
Yes, yeah. If you're in Exodus, you're just about to get into some rough patches after that. So, Reverend, would you like to jump in here?
Absolutely, and thank you, and so honored to be here and to share with you all. And so I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian household in the Baptist church, and where church and family, those were synonymous, that my church family was my family, and the mothers of the church and the fathers of the church and so forth. So I grew up going off to seminary, very conservative seminary, returned to my church and became a pastor at the church I grew up in, and really did not preach with any peace of mind or of heart at all. And once I got to the place where I recognized various passages of scripture that are used as clobber passages, and you may have heard that phrase before, those are the passages, the 6 to 7, depending on how you view them, that are used to, that people interpret to condemn LGBT individuals. So I was reading a passage in Romans about man should not lie with man, and using that as a flog, if you will, just beating myself up. But then I realized that, wait a minute, this passage does not describe my relationship with God, because this passage talks about those who have no heart for God. And I knew I did. And that was the first time that peace began to enter my heart around my spirituality and my sexuality. I later then heard about a theological school in Berkeley, California, where I could get my Master's of Divinity, and that's the professional degree that clergy get to become ordained, with an emphasis on LGBT ministry or queer theology. And I had never heard of such a thing. And I didn't realize I could be still openly gay and a pastor. And so I sold my house, quit my job, said goodbye to my family. We were estranged at that point anyway. And I moved to California. It was during that time that Prop 8 was happening. And so I really got involved with a lot of the fight for marriage equality. But for anyone who has been to Oakland, California, it's a great place to learn how to do community activism, community organizing. So I was able to really learn how to do queer organizing within faith communities. And so that education was just, again, so invaluable. So it indeed helped me, number one, understand that I did not have to throw away the Bible or flush the Bible, down the toilet, because there are various parts I disagreed with it. And then it also helped me to deal with those passages that I did disagree with, to understand that it really was a matter of interpretation. And I needed to understand, as I like to call it, that the scripture is not the last will and testament of a God who's dead. And I'll close with this just to say that the reason why I say that is when a will is enacted, you can't change it at all. It's, those words are locked in. But I believe that the scripture is a living, breathing document of a living, breathing God, that when you interact with it, you can walk away with a word that is especially for you. That's why two people can read the same exact passage and walk away with different interpretations for themselves. So in any case, those are things that I learned, as well as the community activism, which again has really helped shape my ministry today.
Thank you so much. So Rend, I know you're really interested in community building as well. Do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. How's my sound? Good? Great. Okay, so yeah, I mean, first off, wow, this is amazing. I can't believe that I get to hear all of these wonderful perspectives on God and the world and being queer. In terms of myself, you know, as you mentioned, I'm a queer Muslim, so it's been an interesting journey. I grew up in a Muslim household. It also happened to be an abusive household. So there's a lot of spiritual abuse tied into that, which I know is like a very real thing, not just for queer folks, but all kinds of people, because, you know, the power that, for me, the power that God holds, I believe in that, which is why it is so often, oftentimes used against others. In terms of how I understand the world through God, I like to think of it as this, that to exact thing, if you replace the word God with energy, both cannot be created or destroyed. And for me, that helps to really understand God as this infinite thing, right? We know that the universe is never ending, constantly expanding, and that's the same way we talk about God. So that's how I think of God in terms of the world. In terms of how I conceptualize religion into my queerness, I mean, it's been a battle, right? It's been a really, really long struggle for me. There was never a point in my life where I didn't feel, you know, it's hard to say, because part of believing in God is also not believing in God, right? It's like this questioning, this constant questioning. So I don't want to say there was never a point in my life where I felt like I didn't believe in God, but there's definitely never a point in my life where I felt disconnected from source in that regard. Even in my lowest points, just knowing that I was always connected to that. And I think that spirituality for me was always the thing that no one could ever take away from me. So in terms of just like conceptualizing it around this specific discussion and social work and that sort of thing, it's like growing up in such terrible circumstances and having every reason to be that perfect demographic of somebody who would turn away from God. If anything, it brought me closer. And just, I think at the end of the day, I know that the Reverend and some other folks here have been talking about, you know, passages using against others, and those exist in the Quran too, you know, but there's also scholars out there, there's women scholars, there's queer scholars who are looking at other interpretations. And really, like, for instance, the verse that is oftentimes used is, I don't know if anybody's familiar, but there's the story of the prophet Lut, who went to a town, and the story is that there were, I guess the way that the mainstream, I don't want to call it the mainstream, but let's just call it the homophobic interpretation, is that they were punished for being gay, when in reality, some of these other scholars are challenging that notion and saying that in fact they were punished for being, I want to be cognizant of my language here, let's just say sexual misconduct, that was the punishment, that it was a lack of consent and that sort of thing, that it actually had nothing to do with homosexuality, because if that was the case, then why didn't they mention women on women, right? Otherwise, you know, that would be the conversation. So I think just in terms of being able to conceptualize those issues, it all comes down to me. The reason why I love my faith, and my fiance is Episcopalian, and I go to church with her, and I love her faith too. I think it's so beautiful. Every priest I've ever met in Episcopalian church is gay, which I also love. And it is such an affirming space. I mean, we have Good Friday coming up, and the priest asked me, he said it would be a blessing if somebody from a Muslim perspective gave a meditation on that day. And I think that's so beautiful. There's something about the crossover of queerness and religion that just really, I mean, I cried in his office when he asked me, but just being able to be in those spaces and building community, it's not something I do in my day-to-day. I'm a marketing professional. I just, you know, I pay the bills and I find free time where I can, but just even those interactions, finding others or finding others online even, and reminding each other that we're allowed to be alive. Not just that, but God does love us, because God is love. God isn't anything else, right? And that's the way I see the world. And for me, having that direct connection, I know it's there because I feel it. And even if it's BS, whatever, like I'm living a good life and I'm living honestly. And that's how I see it at the end of the day.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was really powerful for me. So Mark, you come to this in sort of two directions, right? Sort of personally, and then this sort of unique professional academic perspective. So can you share a little bit about how you think about these intersections?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I really like that all of us have religion somewhere early in our stories, and each person sort of has dealt with it in a different way. I really resonated with what Reverend Roland was saying about, for me, religion, family, community, they were all the same thing as a child. I grew up in a fundamentalist, evangelical Christian household where my dad was the senior pastor at the church. Literally, my entire extended family went to the church. So I was just soaked in religion growing up. But I was part of a religious community that very much felt there was one right way to do most things, and all the other ways were wrong. There was one right way to be a person of faith. There was one right way to be a Christian, and it was all black and white. And of course, one of the wrong ways from that community to be a Christian would be to be any kind of queer person. So for me, as I was growing up and sort of wrestling with both philosophical questions about the nature of my faith and also who I was and how I might fit or not fit into these sorts of communities, the place I ended up turning to was philosophy. It was this field where I was told that, we critically examine presuppositions. We don't take things for granted. We sort of step back and if the discipline's working right, sort of assess things. So I really wanted that chance to kind of not take the framework of my childhood for granted, but to ask questions about it and be willing to step away if the answers I found were unsatisfying. One of the beautiful things that came out of just being in higher education generally was I learned that there are so many different ways to be religious, both in the Christian faith and in other faiths. And this sort of dichotomy of one right way, or you really don't even bother calling yourself religious at all. What a false dichotomy that was. And building relationships with people whose faiths or lack of faith looked so different depending on the person. So that's just a great thing about higher education, college, something I enjoyed studying philosophy. So where I ended up in my philosophical journey, and it's still an ongoing journey, I ended up also getting confirmed in the Episcopalian Church, which was a way of sort of like coming back to the Christian faith, but in a very, very different position. A lot of the things from my childhood that I think I have good reason to not accept, I didn't have to accept those things to be part of the broader Christian community as an Episcopalian, who is partnered with a Unitarian Universalist. So lots of overlap here. But yeah, the next spot in my journey was I ended up going to law school, and I was thinking specifically about the cases where people were pitting LGBTQ rights up against religious freedom rights. And I really wanted to be able to get involved in these discussions and think more about these issues. So I practiced very briefly before coming here to Wayne State and joining the philosophy faculty. So now I both think about religion, queerness, these sorts of things from a philosophical perspective, but also thinking from the legal framework. Sorry, I did a terrible job writing my own bio because I didn't even mention it. I was a lawyer in there. But also thinking about functionally, how do we as a society come up with laws, policies, social structures that respect queer people, but also respect religious people. And of course, as this panel is a great example, those aren't two separate communities. Many of us have these overlapping identities where we are both. So that's my 2 cents for now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it's interesting how the Episcopal Church is coming up as a solution for, I was definitely also confirmed Episcopalian a number of years ago. So it's a catcher's mitt for some of us who are wondering, I think, and from our home churches. So, but I think that some of your points, Mark, sort of segue into our next question, which is, for many people, spirituality is a really important part of a healthy life. And yet when we're thinking about in the context of the LGBTQ community, there's a lot of potential harm there, or really experienced pain. And so religion, on one hand, is sort of one way that many people practice spirituality, but it's become so polarizing, particularly through fundamentalism and the sort of weaponization of fundamental religions by the political right. And so both sort of through spreading hate against LGBTQ individuals in their communities, but also by backing sexist and anti-LGBTQ policies. So this, as a social worker and for some of us on the call, like this puts us in a difficult position, because on one hand, we want to support people in living healthy lives in which spirituality and sometimes religion is a key part. And on the other hand, we want to support marginalized groups, and religion is being weaponized against to be used to oppress LGBTQ plus people or exclude them from the community. So within this context, and it's also very dynamic across our life course of how we cope with this, how we understand this. So it's quite complicated. So where are the points sort of within this broad context of this tension where you suggest sort of pushing people or oneself to engage in dialogue? And where is it important to draw a harsher line to protect the LGBTQ plus community as an oppressed group? So does anyone want to start, or I can call on somebody?
I'll jump in deep into the pool on that question. So how we're seeing that played out, particularly in today's time, is through harmful religious liberty legislation, where someone will say, my religious freedom is better than yours, or mine trump yours, and thus I have the right to discriminate against you, solely on the basis of religious conviction. And so at the core of that, of what we're seeing, and we really need to kind of unpack it, is a phrase in which I call Christian dominionism. We know what white supremacy is, and Christian dominionism is very similar, where your particular form of Christianity dominates everything else and everyone else's opinion. I really loved what others have stated, in particularly when we're talking about the connectiveness between world religions. And one of the key things that I see, it is really the concept of light, that most all world religions really kind of gravitate around that, whether it's enlightenment or the light itself. And the reason why I bring that up is one of the key things that I believe Christian dominionists fail to see is our common humanity. So when it comes for someone to speak up and to speak out in favor of whether it is LGBT equality, whether it is reproductive rights, or even now this whole topic of banning books because you don't like the topic of them, it's all kind of comes back down to this whole concept of, my point of view is better and greater than yours, is to have conversations, especially around the dinner table or the Thanksgiving table, around if you have other people within your family or your world who don't see this more broader common humanity vision that you do, is to point out that, do you recognize the harm that can come from a particular law being stated for someone to lose their job, to lose their home, to lose custody of their children? Because oftentimes people who want to argue for a harmful religious liberty legislation fail to really show the harm that people go through. And I think that is how you begin to win the hearts and minds, to really get people to stop in their tracks, to really point out that we all, as you know, Americans, put it that way, from a U.S. perspective, you know, have the, you know, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of, you know, happiness should belong to everyone. And so I'm going to be a person who's going to stand up and speak out on behalf of other people. And so I think that is going to be really key for others to see that as well.
I'll jump in here. I also think that in practice, as a social worker, a way to go about that, and this might answer one of the other questions that I think will come up later, but just to encourage, if they're not already, encouraging your organization to be LGBTQ plus allied, not just friendly, not just affirming, but allied. And I can say that where I'm employed at the Hannan Center, we are very, very, very allied. We certainly have queer people on staff. We have partnered with SAGE Metro Detroit, which is an organization that serves LGBT older adults. And SAGE has also gone through a process with us prior to me being there, but has gone through a process with the organization in setting up standards of practice. I can also say that in interpersonal, so that's sort of like on an organizational level. In interpersonal practice, I think it can be a little trickier. I can't say that I've ever experienced a situation where I've been in conflict with a client directly because of their religious views about sexuality, but I have been in conflict with clients who are homophobic. And I've, you know, I'll handle that in a number of ways. I think something like that has really got to be on a case-by-case basis. But I know that we have a lot of emerging social workers here. So the most important thing is you have to take care of yourself, right? You have to take care of yourself. You also really do have to take care of your client. So maybe there are options. The number one thing I think is to have good supervision and talk with your supervisor about such a situation first. I also set boundaries. If I hear something homophobic, if I hear something racist, I don't necessarily disclose my sexuality, but I will set boundaries right away if I see somebody go in there to say, hey, listen, while we're engaging, there's appropriate ways that we can communicate, and this isn't really one of them. So that's just something that you can do right there, but also just be out. Be out, be out, be out, be out. You don't have to be out with all of your clients, but be out in your workplace, be out in your organizations, be out in your community.
I'll add a few things here, kind of picking up with the last bit about like the be out. And I think this will also connect with some questions later. Like some of us have the privilege to get to be out, and other people are in less safe circumstances where being out is not an option, or is not an easy an option. So I think if I think about my own life, the fact that I have this wonderful job at Wayne State in a community where I feel really supported and safe, I think it's that like be out is definitely something I want to say to myself. And I think it's important. I can, to some small extent, help create protection for other queer people for whom being out is not as safe or not as easy, because what we've seen as a society is that so much of people's changing views, you can give them arguments all day. And I'm a philosopher, I love to give people arguments, but like often this is not the thing that changes hearts and minds. It's relationships, experiences, caring about people who you know are queer and know who are out. So I think, yeah, so I'm echoing what Daniel had to say. I I think also from my perspective as a teacher, someone who's teaching philosophy classes, this question is, it's one that I face because part of my job is to help people engage in dialogue. And if my students can't authentically bring their views to class and feel safe saying what they think, sort of wrestling with how their faith might fit with worldviews that they're drawn to, or worldviews that they don't understand, or worldviews that other people accept and that they don't, I want them to have the freedom to explore, ask questions, to make mistakes. I don't want my students to have to feel like they get it all perfect right the first time. So I need to create space for that. But I also need to make sure that while people are exploring, and they may be exploring with deeply ingrained homophobic or transphobic views, that I don't make the space one where other people can't also freely explore. So one thing I try to do in classes is differentiate. I say, you're welcome to disagree in my classes. This is going to be important, but you must always do so respectfully. And then figuring out what those norms of respect look like. So things like using someone's preferred pronouns, their proper pronouns, the name they go by, these sorts of things. These are ways of showing respect for a person and who they are. You don't have to have some sort of fully fleshed out philosophical view about how your religious faith overlaps with, various LGBTQ identities before you can treat someone with respect in these spaces. And so that means, not making homophobic remarks or sexist remarks or transphobic jokes or things like this. So, life throws curveballs, and I'm constantly trying to figure out how exactly best to explain to my students the freedom I want them to have to bring their views honestly to class, while also creating boundaries where the space is respectful for everybody and respectful for people whose perspectives so often are left to the side, which are, not only queer people, people of color, women. So yeah, I mean, that's not a full answer, but it's sort of a framework, at least.
I love the idea of working within a framework because there's so many complexities that arise, and I think from a philosophical standpoint, it's really interesting, right? Because as you said, it's like an ongoing, there's no answer really, right? If there's an answer, then you're kind of doing it wrong. And I think that's also the cool thing about both queerness and religion as well, and life in general. To me, what I always tell myself, if someone tells you they have an answer, they're either lying to you or they're trying to sell you something. So I don't trust people who have answers. In terms of the context, from my perspective, it's complicated, right? It's complicated for everybody. From my own experience, it's complicated in the regard that there's so many layers. I'm queer, I'm Muslim, I'm Palestinian. So it's also political, right? And I think in the American context of being Muslim and being queer, it's like the mosques that I used to go to were monitored by the FBI, right? And I think that's true for a lot of spaces that aren't even Muslim, but maybe racialized by the FBI, right? So I think that's something to also consider, is what kind of political freedoms are people afforded when they are also, up against the wall in terms of how they're allowed to be political, or how they're allowed to even express wanting rights. This specific story comes to mind with this question where, I'm also political in the direction of, I'm very left, and it's hard when you preach, abolish, or, work towards some sort of police reform or abolition or something like that, when the only option I had growing up was to call the police when I needed help. But I was calling the police in a country that, doesn't necessarily believe in the rights of my people. And when the police would show up and I would have my abuser say things to the police like, oh, this is our religion, this is our culture, it's okay that this is what I'm doing. And then having the social worker get involved and say, well, there's nothing we can do here. I think that resonated deeply with me when actually, way back when I wanted to become a social worker. And I think it's such a wonderful job. Unfortunately, I wish social workers would get paid a lot more. I mean, you guys should be getting paid at least $200,000 a year, in my opinion. But anyway, that's besides the point. And I remember speaking up in class once and talking about that nuance, right? And I remember hearing a fellow student say, well, you know, if I am a social worker to somebody's home and they're telling me that I need to respect the cultural and religious beliefs, then that's just my job. And I felt like I was the only person in the room at the time who could really speak from experience and say, actually, that's not your job. Your job is to protect those people. And although the system is flawed, you need to use whatever tools you have to do that, right? And, you know, just like everything else, I don't think there's an answer to this question. However, I do resonate with what was said earlier in terms with when it's yourself engaging with a conversation, you should always protect yourself in that moment. However, for me, it's always about remembering I'm not always the most oppressed person in the room, right? Although it may feel that way sometimes, you don't know what the effect that what the others in the room are at the effect at, right? Or at the effect of, and what resources they may or may not have to contextualize something that's taken me years to unlearn in terms of my internalized homophobia, right? So it's complicated. It's really, really complicated with all these layers. And I think it truly is on the work of the allies to push those conversations and to put themselves at the front lines. And I don't think there is a harsh line for them to stand up for LGBTQ folks. I don't think there is. I think that they need to be the ones who are the armor for us, because again, with all those nuances, it's not fair for us to be the ones confronted. If we choose to, for sure, we should, right? For me personally, I'm experiencing that personally, right? I've always been out to my family. However, it's only become more evident, the disconnect between how connected I truly can be to my family since I've decided to get married, right? So there's certain things where it's like, we have the only choice a queer person really has to make is who they want to share that with, and how out they want to be. And ultimately our sacrifice is the ones we love. It's the privileges we have in the world, even the way that we present ourselves. So I think it's just about how much are we willing to sacrifice when we're on that front line, and also acknowledging that there are others before us who have done the work. And if we feel compelled to do that work, then we should. However, we're not obligated to.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to comment on this question? And then I just want to remind, Kristen put it in the chat, but we're going to pause after this for audience questions. So if something's brewing, go ahead and put that in the chat and we'll get to it in a second.
Let me just follow up my own comments when I was talking about religious liberty. And I was careful to say harmful religious liberty, because there are many laws on the books about protecting religious minorities, and those we see are very helpful and it's just very positive. It's that, again, a lot of people, particularly we saw this after marriage equality passed, that many switched their tactics and use this whole concept of my religious rights are better than yours, and then they have taken the same language but then twisted it in a way to really make it a harmful, not only harmful but weaponized it. And the reason why I just wanted to go back to it is that there are many laws on the books that should protect LGBT individuals and others. And when people talk about these radical leftists are coming and they're going to force their agenda down our throat, that if you are a religious cleric or clergy, already on the books, you're not forced to marry anyone you don't want to marry, or to even have anyone to join your religious community that you don't want, because that is protected under religious liberty laws. And what I think, like I said, this is a very contemporary issue that many people really should understand, because that is how the religious right are utilizing and really trying to strip us of rights we thought we had. And it's like, why is this even up for debate? And this is the reason why.
Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so we might go to the next panelist question. But if you think of something, folks, please stick it in there and we'll come back. Okay, so I think this sort of connects to some of what you all have already talked about. But, of course, some people have been welcomed by their communities. LGBTQ people have been welcomed by their communities, but some have been harmed, shunned, and been through really terrible experiences through their churches, and people cope with those experiences differently. So what guidance do you have for folks who have chosen to leave or separate from their communities, and for those who have tried to advocate within their community, even though they may not feel safe?
I can jump in here. From a clinical perspective and the population that I work with, which is primarily LGBTQ young people, I see this a lot in terms of chosen communities or leaving spiritual communities to kind of find their own form of spirituality, right? And I think that this kind of got brought up with the last question too, in terms of you have to be aware of where your limits are, right? You have to be aware of when you get tired of advocating for yourself a little bit, because you're allowed to do that. And I think that really validating and normalizing that, hey, you are allowed to be tired of this. And as the therapist in the room, creating that space for them to explore that and really draw those boundaries so that they can figure out not only the efforts that they want to put into creating change for themselves, but also finding spaces where they feel safe, right? And that is my goal in session, at least, is to be able to create that space. But I do think, we've talked a lot about things being individualized and case by case, and it really, you have to figure out where your boundaries are with this, because it can be exhausting and it can feel really invalidating. And I think especially within the queer community and as a queer person, we really need to work on kind of resolving shame, and these kind of harmful or toxic environments that create more of that can just be really damaging to any kind of progress that you're trying to make for yourself or your mental health. So that's kind of my approach, is just creating that space and really encouraging whatever kind of boundaries that you need to set for yourself to make that happen.
Here's a couple of thoughts that I think really line up with what Rachel was saying. I know for a lot of queer friends who have left religious communities, there's often this feeling of guilt, something that you owe the people that you're taking space from. This idea, sometimes it's because leaving a religious tradition causes tension in the family. You don't feel as close to your parents anymore, or your relatives, or this community. And you feel like you somehow owe it to the community to find a way to make it work. Well, I think it's laudable to try to persevere in relationships despite friction and tension. That's a normal part of human life. At some point, so very often, this guilt starts to feel very one-sided. It's, the queer people keep trying to find a way to accommodate to keep these relationships. And so often the family members keep asking for accommodation. It's not a mutual meeting halfway. And I think when families and communities fail to sort of like meet queer people in sort of like, I don't want to use the word compromise, that's not really the right word, but some sort of like, where both sides like bend to form something. I want to, I guess in a way, maybe I'm talking to myself, but also to other queer people, there's like a way in which like, there's nothing to feel guilty about if you take that space, if you take that separation. And that can look like a number of different things. So that's one thing. I had a second thing, but I lost it. It just went out of my head. So I'll stop for now.
Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, I think one thing that's just coming out to me as I'm listening to this response is that taking space for oneself and guilt are just so part of so many religions, right? Like as a Catholic, like being guilt was, I mean, that was what we were taught to feel all the time. So it's such a natural response to taking any time for yourself for so many religious people and people in families. So, and I think the family aspect of this is really important, that it's religion and holidays and all of that is really connected to like the way that family is. And I think that's sort of that line of religion and spirituality that I don't know if that's an important line for other people, but does anyone else have any other comments on that? And then we have a question from the audience.
As someone who is religious and with the people I meet in my online communities, something I like to do is affirm those who choose no longer to believe in God, because I think a lot of times, you know, the guilt of being a queer person who's religious is, I think, different than anyone else, because it's like every religion is homophobic and to some extent, right? Not saying every denomination of every religion, every person who's religious is homophobic. It just exists within it, and it's a reality. So I think affirming those who choose to leave, and if they seek guidance, my only advice would be just find a community that you feel loved in. That's the most important thing. Find a community that gave you that feeling and be there. Don't be alone. Don't isolate yourself. That's the best thing I could say. Please don't isolate yourself.
That's really important advice for mental health. Okay, we have a number of questions now. The wheels are turning in the audience, so thank you for sharing your questions, folks. So the first question, Kristen, do you want to read the first question?
Sure, yeah. I'll actually read another attendee's question first before mine, just to put that in front. So Louis asked, what about those who are disadvantaged? So they said, for example, like what steps do you think those who are gay and disabled should take to create their own relationship in life? And I think obviously in pertaining to religion as well as an intersection to that.
I think that's a very poignant question. And one of the things that I like to focus on is the importance of holistic health, mind, body, and spirit. Oftentimes we focus on, our minds, like the pursuit of education, watch the news, having intellectual conversations, or go to the gym and, watch your nutrition, improve that. So mind and body, a lot of people have that, no problem. It's the spirit part that gets neglected. And oftentimes people, conflate that or basically say that going to a religious service is the same as attending to your spirit, which is not the case. We've heard people talk about, I'm more spiritual than I am religious. And, there is something to that simply attending to, your emotional state. Your emotional state is very much connected to your spirit. And what are the things that really feed your spirit? Being in a community, whether it's a religious, community or congregation, or whether it's around friends who really do nurture. It's one thing to go out with friends to party and so forth, and that's, great recreation. But it's also good to be around other people who can really, in a sense, nurture that side, that part of you that you just really feel like, I feel grounded. And how do you know whether your spirit is being fed? And it's that feeling of feeling grounded. And you're not really flighty and so forth. And so again, even the conversation about disability or being differently abled is that it really, each of us have, I think, our various pathways to tread. And it is good for us to find the ways that speak to us and nurture us in ways that are significant. And so, depending on what the particular, disability or being differently abled is being community of people who understand. And because you don't always need to be the educated one educating other people about your disability, but being around people who you don't have to explain, you don't have to do code switching oftentimes, because they just simply get you. And that's, I think, really the key thing is focus on mind, body, and spirit.
Another student sent me a very related question, so I'm just going to put that out there to keep the panel going, but I think it's really related to what Reverend Rowland just said. So this student says, coming out and self-affirming your sexuality or gender identity and expression can be really marginalizing and isolating. What advice do you have to those youth and young adults coming out with minimal to no support? Spirituality can be at the root of their isolation through guilt and marginalizing through shame. What advice would you have for them to gain spiritual faith balance?
One piece of just kind of, I guess, maybe practical advice is because of the internet, so often there are groups of people that have formed who have experienced this before. So I, coming from the Christian faith, I know more about those spaces for either ex-Christians or Christians who are Christians of a different stripe than they used to be. There are, just online communities that often then turn into in-person communities where people can find sort of places to vent, to process, to joke around about weird niche shared inside experiences that other people aren't going to get. So, but it's not always easy to find these communities, right? So there's a way in which, without knowing the particular question asker's faith background, I can't give targeted advice. I'm happy to say more things about some of the Christian spaces that exist now that do this at some point, if that would be helpful. But I think, just as Ren pointed out, there's homophobia, transphobia in so many different faiths. For all those faiths, there are people who are queer in all the faiths and who have grappled with this, some who have left, some who have found ways to navigate and stay. And we form communities. So I think a good way to deal with those feelings of isolation or marginalization are to find people who feel that too.
Something I heard recently about coming out that I thought was really profound. Coming out has never been a safe thing for me, yet I've, flirted with death in that regard anyway. I don't recommend anybody coming out until they feel safe, whether that's in your home space, financially, whatever the case may be. However, something I heard recently that really helped was be prepared for the emotional consequences of coming out as well. And I'm sure many queer people can relate to this. Coming out doesn't just happen once, it happens all the time. People don't believe you. People have their own demons that they're fighting. People are also, denial is a very, very powerful thing. So coming out is really a never-ending process, whether it's people close to you or people, as you were saying, communities that you find. But that really resonated with me. You really need to be prepared for those emotional consequences, because it is, depending on where you are in your life, it can vary in terms of intensity. And I would recommend therapy. I would recommend a very strong support network. I would say those are the two key things. Because look, you might crumble, you might fall apart, but if you have the right place to do it, it won't be the end of the world.
Yeah, I love that. And also just, when I was going through my own coming out process, and as I work with folks who are coming out in a clinical setting, I try my motto, and I might have stolen this from my own therapist at the time, is that, it took me a long time to come out to myself. So that process is just as important as coming out to others. Right. And I tried to allow, people a lot of grace as they adjusted to the new kind of out me, which I've got to say I was really fortunate and to have a lot of support in my life, which I'm super thankful for. But I always told myself, give this time, because it took me time to come out to me. So it's going to take other people time too. Right. And so, yeah, if you have that foundation of just really knowing who you are, at the very least, you always have that. And yeah, find a good therapist too.
Yeah, and just to kind of continue this thought of coming out, I've come out 2 times in my life. First as a gay man, and second as somebody living with HIV. And I think, when I say like be out, I do want people to. I don't want that message to be like, come out, right? I don't want that to be misinterpreted. If you are out, I always just think there's so much power in being really frank. I go a little bit overboard with it. Every place that I've worked, they're like, wow, you're really kind of like gay right away. And I do it, it's super conscious. It's very conscious. It's sort of my defense mechanism, but it's also just a commitment that I've made to normalizing things as much as you can, and as much as is safe for you to do so. I came out probably in the late 90s, where I just noticed so much editing in how I talked. What did you do this weekend? I didn't say I went to a movie with my boyfriend. I went to a movie. But as I became safer for me to do so, I made sure that I injected that into the conversation. I went to the movie. I went to the movies with my boyfriend. And there's still vulnerability in that. Just me saying that I'm HIV positive to all of you, my heart goes in my throat a little bit, but have a safe place for you to talk about that first, and then keep going with it with your friends, with your therapist. And there was another question in the chat about if you are in a homophobic, or if you do hear homophobic comments in your workspace and you don't feel safe to go to your supervisor about it. If we're talking social work practice, you can always get supervision from outside of your workplace. It doesn't have to be your supervisor at work. There's a lot of ways to do that. And again, I also think just therapy, like everyone should have a therapist, I think.
I want to chime in as well. This is a really good conversation because particularly, going into social work, it's those who you work with, it is always a clash of worldviews. It's your worldview and your client's worldview. And oftentimes it's hard to distinguish between when is your worldview kind of superseding, your client's. And a quick story is when I was putting together like my master's thesis, I attended a support group for Black gay men. And the age range was wide from like teenager, like late teens, like 19, 20 to those in their 60s and 70s. And those who were young, one of the young men said, you know what, if mama is not for me being gay, and the church is not for me being gay, I ain't coming out of the closet. And that was such a profound statement. And you recognize there are many, closeted LGBT people who attend mainline denominational churches. Why? Because that's where their family is. And that kind of goes back to what we said earlier about the importance of, that family unit. And so as you are interfacing with someone, they very well could have a more happier, freer life, coming out of the closet, but maybe not. And, oftentimes we want to impose our worldview upon someone else's and say, you're going to feel better and you'll be more empowered, yada, yada, yada. Not necessarily so, if indeed, coming out means that now they have cut off their lifeline, with family. And so the best thing that I like to say is that when you rest your head at night, do you rest? Do you go to sleep in peace? That's the telltale sign. If you are able to get to a place of peace, and even though you might live a life where you are one person during the daytime and another person at nighttime, are you able to find that type of connection between those, multiple selves that you have? If you are, then power to you. If you're not, then that is when it comes to helping someone to find that type of integration with their lives and to help them understand the journey of coming out. Because it is okay to say no to a family member and to say, you know what, even though you've been my lifeline, I have to cut you off because being in this family is toxic to me. And it robs my breath. It steals my breath away. And so thus I can no longer stay here. When you are then having someone at that stage, then it is very imperative to help them through the coming out process. And you very well may then become their lifeline, if you were helping them. And then obviously, helping them find other communities, and everyone hopefully on this call knows, finding and building your family of choice if your biological family no longer serves you.
I think I messed up the spotlight. That was so profound, and then I messed up the spotlight, letting Ren back in. One moment, please. While I'm trying to figure out how to fix the view, one thing that has come up, and maybe folks can speak to this a little bit more, that I realize that I have found through church communities is just finding a community can be hard for some people. And some people feel actually that they have never truly been part of a community, that they have been in places that they felt very uncomfortable, that they never really could let themselves be themselves in or really have those deep friendships that I think you all are talking about trying to find, that you need to find these safe spaces so that you can cry and come out and be super vulnerable and then be supported through that whole joyful, sad, all kinds of feelings process. So maybe could you speak a little bit to for folks or thinking back in your own life or working with clients that were trying to find a safe community, and what suggestions you have for them while I fix the audio, the video.
I have really sort of passionate thoughts about this. Now this is not research based. This is not academic. I struggle with the word community. So in this context, I want to say that in terms of a safe community, a community can be one person. I think that we live with this, I'll say it, myth of this group of friends or this magical safe space with lots of people where we belong and who accept us and support us. And to have a sense of belonging and safety, you just need one person. I want that community so bad, but that expectation, it really makes it almost impossible for me to have that experience.
Daniel, that's exactly what I was going to say. Just redefining our expectations of what a community is. It's nothing like on TV. And as we all know, we've all been caught in the crossfire of online debates or even just among our friends. We're always going to disagree on things, and just accepting that part of it. And just, again, just to reiterate, finding community, it could be in one person, it could be in two people. Heck, they don't even have to be queer, you know? So just find love. It's out there. Love is out there.
Thank you so much. I think that's so important. So I'm going to shift our conversation a little bit to talking about sort of social justice. This question is real. I'm a newcomer to Detroit, and this is a really important question to me. So I'm excited to hear your thoughts. So many churches, particularly Black Christian churches, are historical and contemporary civil rights leaders, organizing people, caring for their communities, battling local, state, and nationally sanctioned injustices. However, many of these churches' teachings, as we've discussed, are homophobic and sexist to some degree. And so some progressive social movements have chosen to disconnect from church leadership, church spaces. I've been in progressive movements that folks won't meet in a church, even if it's a free space, and we really need a free space, et cetera. So there's some people who are really choosing to disconnect for potentially legitimate reasons. While others have continued to work with church leaders and accepted those limitations and the potential harm of the viewpoints of these groups. So where do you see religious institutions fitting into the LGBTQ plus rights movement right now or in the future?
So I'm thinking about what Reverend Rowland said earlier about, I think you called it Christian dominionism. Yeah, so I think for the last 40 years or so in the United States, there's been this narrative that like religion is somehow on the right, and that the right is somehow also the anti-LGBTQ side. And this is, speaking of myths, this is also a myth for several reasons. One, it gives into this false equivalence between Christianity and religion. So often people, when they talk about religious language in the United States, they're only talking about Christians. They're forgetting the broad, beautiful, diverse array of religions we have represented in the United States. So that's one way in which it's a myth. Another way in which it's a myth is it homogenizes Christianity in a way that doesn't reflect reality and shouldn't reflect reality. So it seems to me in the last, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, there has been sort of like a countercultural movement where more people are like staking space as religious progressives of various stripes. So I think it's really important to sort of like continue to elevate those voices and support those people. I understand how certain people's religious trauma leads them to want to just not have faith be part of the queer movement generally. And I sympathize with that. And I don't want to ask of those people that they have to forge any of those relationships. But I think for those of us who are in a healthy enough relationship with religion, I think we should welcome this sort of reframing of the narrative that religiousness and Christianity, that neither of those things are oppositional concepts to full inclusion, respect, support for LGBTQ people and the LGBTQ community.
I love that. When I hear this question, I think of, from a religious standpoint and my understanding of religion, I always grew up knowing that God is justice, that there is divine justice. And even if there's a justice on earth, there is justice with God. Now, I understand that's not something everybody believes. However, I do believe that if you believe in God, you absolutely have to believe that. And I would never say that anybody's faith is invalid. However, I do think it's fair to say a faith that hates is invalid. And I don't think that's a wrong thing to say. And I think in terms of where religion fits in the movement, It's all about, like, for instance, when I think of Jesus, I'm like, man, that guy was so cool. He would be on this call today, you know? Same with like the prophets that I look up to in the Quran. It's like those guys were trying to get rid of bad things in the world, you know? So homophobia is a bad thing. It's simple math, you know? And sometimes I think it gets overcomplicated on purpose by the political right and all these things that we're fighting against. They do it on purpose. It's their tactic. Let's make it confusing. Let's hit people in the heartstrings. Let's divide. Let's conquer and divide, right? So I think it's, the way I see it is like where it fits is just going back to the basics. Why would, I always like to joke that the reason the prophet came to the Arabs to bring Islam is because at the time the Arabs were the worst people. They were burying their daughters alive. So they needed a whole brand new religion to bring them back, So I think it's all about just bringing it back to the basics and being like, okay, what are the actual fundamentals that we could bring into this conversation? It's about peace. It's about justice. It's about unity across faiths.
I love this conversation because so as a non-religious person reading the Bible with Dan in our podcast, what I'm when we started the project, I was thinking as a queer person, like, okay, I'm going to hate this. There's going to be so many things that I'm just going to be so mad about. And there are a lot of really confusing things and a lot of things that we have a lot of questions on. But one of the biggest things that I've learned doing this project is that like the rhetoric matters so much, right? The words, like reading this as a newbie here and reading the actual words, and granted, we're only in Exodus. So like, like Dan said, call us in 5 years and see where we're at. But what I'm finding is that it's the rhetoric that can be harmful, right? And what I'm hopeful, I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to see that rhetoric change. And kind of back to our finding community topic. It's like, again, as a non-religious person, I can't just assume that because somebody's religious means that they don't like queer people or don't agree with me or my lifestyle, right? Some of the closest people in my life are like a group of 50 to 60-year-old Catholic women. And I never would have guessed that when I was going through my coming out process, that I would have kept a community like that, right? So it's about challenging that bias too, and challenging, like, where do these fears come from? When you really look at it, it's divisive rhetoric that has been used in politics. And I think if we all would, benefit from just taking a step back from that sometimes and really just looking at the content, right?
Daniel, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think the content and the context, like I'm we're both nerding out with this podcast, but I've got my New Oxford Annotated Bible, which gives me all kinds of like history and, well, this word sort of really meant that type of thing. So it actually does take some of the wildness out of it in that regard. But also just somebody else, the other thing about doing this podcast, because I'm not a Christian, but in sort of doing the promotion of it, what Mark was saying, there is like a huge community of queer people of faith podcasters. They're on Instagram. If you just look up like #queer Muslim, #queer Christian. If you are looking for that community, it's really as simple as that. Lots of great podcasts out there. There's one called Queerology that I've listened to a few times. That's pretty interesting because that person's also a psychotherapist. But that's all I've got to say right now.
My faith community, the Metropolitan Community Church of Detroit, we have our tagline that says we are bringing spirituality out of the closet. And one of the reasons why we say that is I remember when I was living in California and fighting for marriage equality, and those of us who were queer people of faith or queer spiritual people, we would come in with our clerics on, like I'm wearing today. And going into a group of, queer activists who were not religious, you could just see, their, necks bristle and, the hair on their necks bristle. And just, and it's understandable because we know that people have been victimized, as I call it, through spiritual violence. And that spiritual violence is when anyone uses the name of God or religion or, the church, the mosque, the synagogue, in a way to degrade their humanity. That is what we call spiritual violence. And so we get that. And so oftentimes, part of your question was talking about, working within Black church communities and, are they, in a sense, kind of, homophobic, or they, really have a lot of gender bias? And quite a few do, but quite a few, aren't as well. And, you'll be surprised to find some, but oftentimes when I have worked with those within the Black church around the issue of, queer rights, LGBT equality, the whole topic of, get off the civil rights bandwagon, that's not you. And, I would then bring up, quotes from Dr. King, or even, Coretta Scott King, who would, injustice anywhere is, a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And where Coretta Scott King was on record saying that, as Dr. King would say that, he meant that for everyone, including LGBT individuals. And that when you're talking about a movement such as the civil rights movement, that no one can really own a movement. And these are words, those aren't my words, that's, by Audre Lorde. These are her words saying, that a movement, the ideas and the tactics that come from a movement are free for anyone to come along and to, use within their own struggle. Because again, it goes back to that human struggle that we all go through. And that if you are indeed talking about justice for all over here, then it's kind of hypocritical to say, oh, but not you, that we didn't mean it for you. And so, it's not until members and leaders within, the Black church really grapple with that and understand that, to say that, no, the civil rights movement or civil rights for all people, not just African Americans, that it does, apply to the immigrant, that it does apply to women, that it does apply, to those who are, Muslim and so forth, and, those who are not of your particular, religious base. And last thing, very quick story. I was doing a presentation to a Black church audience, and this gentleman kept yelling at me, but what about Sodom and Gomorrah? What about Sodom and Gomorrah? And this was a gentleman who ran an HIV, ministry out of his church. And it was very apparent to me and then to other people that this is a pastor, made a distinction between those who he felt, had HIV through drug use versus those through, same gender loving relation. And to point out that, distinction and really hypocrisy, he really didn't be quiet. He was quiet and he sat back in his seat and recognized that he was doing a disservice to people within his own community. And so that is what I'm talking about, really helping people to say that this whole concept of spiritual violence, you may not recognize that that's what you're engaged in, but if you recognize that what you're saying and doing is repelling people away from this truth and light that you feel that people need to be drawn to, would it give you pause? And oftentimes when you challenge leaders on that, it does.
Thank you for that. I want to keep with this line of conversation for another minute or so, because I think one of the things that I've seen so far in working with students who have this background, and Kristen sort of provided the phrase, love the person, hate the sin. And this sort of concept that we can compartmentalize people or people can fragment themselves. And, you know, in America, we somehow fragment out sexuality a lot, even though it's like central to human relationship. Anyways, right. So how do we help people? Like, what do you say to people who have that sort of comment? And as social workers, who, coming back to our concept of seeing people holistically, mind, body, spirit, whole life, that comment in coming up in class, coming up in conversations with future social workers, you know, what do you think about that? How do you handle that? And how would you suggest or talking people through that thinking a little bit more?
I'll say a couple things quick as obviously a non-social worker. So my short answer to the question, how do I feel about the phrase, is I don't like it. It's not a good phrase. I wouldn't encourage anyone to use it. But right, the question is, people use it, so what do you do? And I think the answer is going to be so highly context dependent on your relationship with that person, on what their assumptions are, who they're saying that to, versus if they're saying that to me, or if they're sort of like imposing that on somebody else. So there's all sorts of variables. So I'll take one kind of situation, one sort of critique that I think a phrase like love the person, hate the sin. I think one of the critiques you can make is very often people who say that are people who, you know, might accept a clobber passage, like Reverend Roland was saying earlier, or have some sort of like simplistic, unreflective set of reasons why they think, you know, your gender expression or who you love or something like that is a sin. So I think it's unloving to not put in the work to question why you're so confident that something is a sin in the first place. And I think if you're saying you love the person and hate the sin, but you haven't done the work to understand your own biases, your own history, counter arguments for why people disagree with you over whether or not that's sin, that's not very loving. So I think very often people who say that have not, I don't want to say there's ever like a situation where you could earn the right to say that, but they often have failed to like do their basic due diligence to ground their assertions that someone's an important aspect of who someone is constitutes sin. I mean, there are all other critiques I could make, but I'll stop myself there.
Yeah, I think challenging people's perception of sin is definitely the first step. But as I've learned, some people change their minds, some don't. And my last straw that I go for in that argument is, well, if you believe that God is just and you believe that humans deserve justice, irregardless of any condition that we should be identified with or that's forced upon us, then what you're doing is, by calling something a sin, by calling somebody's existence a sin, is you are taking away their rights in the eyes of God and in the eyes of government. And if that goes against your faith, then why would you support it? But some people are just not going to change their minds. And I think that's part of it, is accepting that and just keeping a safe distance.
I think as a social worker, this is something I haven't encountered. This statement, I've encountered it in my life, and but I'm a much better person in my practice than I probably am in my life. And let's say I had a client, a parent who was saying something like this about their child. That might be a point where, yeah, I've discussed with them what is sin for them. But I would probably move the conversation away from their perception of their child and maybe move the conversation towards their perception of themselves and their own shame.
Unmuting to say I love that.
Yeah, I actually, it took me a minute to remember this, but I actually worked for a program This was in one of my field placements where we worked with families who had a CPS contact due to suspected neglect or abuse because of their child's gender expression or sexual orientation. And one of our main like starting points with that conversation when we would do kind of family therapy for reunification is to start with the love part, right? So like I hate that statement personally, though, like love the person, hate the sin. But from a framework for social work, I don't actually hate that, because there's like, if we're using a true strength-based perspective here, like, sure, then let's focus on the love, right? Let's figure out how to use that love to make sure that we're not creating a harmful environment for your child. Right. I think if they hate the sin, they can hate the sin, but you got to love your kid. So let's start there and figure out how to work from there. And I think there's a lot of potential in that. Personally, yeah, don't like that, but that's my professional answer.
All right, thank you so much for these thoughts. This is really interesting. So to sort of go with the professional piece of this, and some of you have raised some things about this before, but of course, we all are working for social service agencies in some capacity in that we work with other people. And some of us are also formally providing services to other people. And within these agencies, most social services really struggle to commit to truly inclusive practice for LGBTQ+ people, and also many other groups. And so, and this comes up a lot when I'm talking to students about their field placements, where of course they don't have a lot of power in those placements. They're not the executives, they're not the, advisory boards. And so how do you suggest, particularly speaking to a student audience, who might be confronting overtly religious people or people who are sort of actively not using people's pronouns or misgender, naming people, using dead names for people or other sort of active harm in their conversations? How do you deal with religion-based anti-LGBTQ+ policies within not explicitly religious settings, but people are bringing that religious viewpoint into the setting to harm people, including our social work interns, unfortunately?
Well, I will say that it goes back to that question goes back to what I was stating earlier about really understanding how people are using harmful religious liberty arguments to get their way in the public sector. Many of us may have heard of stories of, doctors refusing, healthcare to, a, same gender loving couple, or therapists who saying, I cannot service a child who's come out of the closet because that's against my religion. And again, these incidences have nothing to do with, a religious community per se, but again, it's someone's own religious conviction we're seeing, being taken to the courts. And again, I believe it is, asking the question, should religion, anyone's religion, be used as a weapon against someone else? Or is it, something to really, bring and, uphold people? Because for someone who is a Christian fundamentalist conservative, and to claim that they are a religious minority and that those laws, should protect them, they are the ones who really have the burden of proof to talk about, to show that, how are you being harmed by someone coming out of the closet, or someone wanting to, use your services to, take to photograph their, same-sex wedding. And so it is very important for those of us who do believe in equality. And you don't have to be religious to do this, but, it's just simply, pointing out that, this is an example how you are using your religion as a weapon to, subjugate someone else. And for that, I can stand up and speak out against. And there are a variety of websites and organizations that can really help you develop your own talking points, or even how to, speak, how to be that type of advocate when you're in a counseling situation, or if you're speaking publicly. So you don't have to feel that you need to know the Bible or some sacred text to, do this. There's a lot of great resources that are out there. And let me just say that, particularly on that last question about, supporting, young people who come out of the closet and their families don't. Many of you may be familiar with the Ruth Ellis Center. They have the Ruth Ellis Institute as well, that is solely devoted to helping families get back together. Rachel talked about family reunification. They have a great resource to help people to do that. So if indeed that is something that you're looking for, I would recommend that you contact the Ruth Ellis Center.
Any other advice for our social workers out there?
Yeah, I think it's a really tricky one about how do you deal with religion-based anti-LGBTQ policy with a not explicitly religious settings? Are we talking about like our workplaces? Yeah, so I mean, I'll be very honest with you, I avoid it. So part of my interview process is, in terms of talking about their stance on such issues and their culture surrounding such issues. I would love to be the person that goes to a more conservative place and tries to be the disruptor. I just, not necessarily me. And I think as social workers, we do such hard work. Like we have to be careful that we're not like trying to save everybody and everything, right? And you have to take care of yourself. But I think it's always fair if you feel safe to do so to, again, just another thing for social workers at the same time, especially when it comes to ourselves, that's where we advocate the least, I think. We advocate for our clients and we advocate for communities, but maybe there is an opportunity for us to go knock on the door of HR or the admin and say, hey, I'm really curious about this policy. Can you tell me why this is the way it is? And is there any room for change here? Right? Just sort of starting with curiosity and going in as open as you can. Maybe not challenging the policy, but then saying something like, hey, is it okay if we have a Pride Day here in June or what have you? Just trying.
Another thing I'll add to that too is that, like, for the folks on this call that might be graduating, looking for jobs soon, I mean, look, you can spot things, look and see, are they saying their pronouns and email tags, check the healthcare benefits. Do the healthcare benefits include, your spouse? Like, look at those things. It's as Dan said, like I would not be working at a place that didn't validate my sexual orientation, validate my my marriage. I am in a position where I'm fortunate in that I didn't have to look for a job for too long post-graduation. So I'm sure, be reasonable with yourself, but try to avoid those places that don't have affirming language on their website, on their applications, all that stuff.
Just one thing I'll add, I guess, from a legal perspective, because sometimes the solution is a legal one and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just communities making better decisions to value LGBTQ people. So I think one of the tricky things is so many protections for LGBTQ people in the law come at the state and local level. So it gets really hard to talk about just sort of like, what are the rights of queer people in the United States? Because they differ to the extent, depending on what your state or local community has provided. So I think, right, it's one of these pick your battle things. Very rarely is the battle going to be try to change the law, right? But there's a power in knowing what the laws are in your own jurisdiction. I think so often we kind of obsess about national politics, and obviously LGBTQ people have made important gains and strides on the national scene in terms of legal recognition of rights, but it also falls really, really short. We can't be relying on the national government to, well, we can in the sense that I think we should be able to rely on the national government to protect our rights, but that's not a practical reality right now. So it's thinking about all the different levers of legal power that influence where your organization is and what your organization does. So I think sometimes just understanding the law can be helpful.
So if you students and attendees, if you have final questions as we sort of wrap up, but just to extend the question about the law, we know that this is legally a really scary time to be trans particularly, but overall 670 anti-LGBTQ plus bills have been filed since 2018, but recently these bills have really sped up. Having exploded to 239 anti-LGBTQ plus state bills having been introduced just since the start of this year, with half of them specifically targeting trans folks. So this is very scary, and it is largely supportive. And again, this sort of, we've already talked about, right, like the difference between the right wing and religious and the conflating of religion and conservative. But it has been largely supported by conservative, right-wing, fundamentally religious, particularly Christian groups. So how are progressive religious institutions and people currently or planning to respond to this behavior? And what can we all do on the call to help support and protect ourselves and our communities?
I think this is another one where it's so context dependent. I think Dan's advice at the beginning, if you're out, be out. I think relationships with people and being our authentic selves and being the lovable people that we are, and people not helping, just they can't resist but loving us anyways as our queer selves. And sometimes this is the best way to get people to rethink their views. So that's one sort of power that we have, sort of remove the power of the closet if it's if you're in a position to do so. So that's one thing. One other thought, I think there's kind of two different ways you can think about strategy. One strategy is to try to like change the ideological framework from within a religion. So earlier, when Reverend Roland was talking about, there's these 6 or 7 passages in the Christian Bible that people use to clobber one another. There are great resources that say there are other ways to interpret these passages. There are other ways to think of these passages. So that's sort of like meeting a religion on its own terms and trying to sort of like undermine the impetus for anti-LGBTQ animosity. Of course, as Rend pointed out, that doesn't always work. Some people just aren't going to change their minds, but it's one strategy. So yeah, I think it's a multi-pronged approach. And I think if we look at like the full set of organizations who are doing different kinds of work, They're all over the board in terms of what their approaches are. So thinking about what you might want to do personally, maybe think about which approach sort of resonates with you. If you're inside a faith community, what can you do there? If you've left, or if never been a part of a faith community, what's the best sort of way to situate yourself in the space of promoting the well-being of queer people?
I think this is a really interesting discussion because each like religious institution sort of has its own approach and struggle. Like, again, speaking from the Christianity that I'm familiar with, which is Episcopalianism, I know that they are doing their own work, which I think is fantastic. With the Muslim community, we also have we have sects, you know, and I know of some sects that the way it works is it's interesting. It's almost like the more structure there is, the more room there is for debate and to be able to have these discussions. And I think the Reverend said something earlier that I thought was really powerful, which is that, you know, as a leader, you have a responsibility to essentially meet the needs of your people, right? So if your people are telling you, hey, we need change on X, Y, and Z issue, specifically queer issues, then it's that leader's responsibility to now guide the clergy in that direction. And I think that something that can be done where a progressive religious institution may not exist is pressuring your allies, putting the responsibility on the allies on the straights to do the work. Because in my experience, it's hard to feel heard as the queer person. So really putting the onus back on them. Hey, you're my ally. You need to go to mosque. You need to talk to the sheikh. You need to talk to the leaders who support the sheikh's beliefs that go against my existence. So that would be my response.
Thank you so much. I think I'm gonna pause here to give each panelist an opportunity to just sort of share any final thoughts or anything you didn't get to say. And if you're looking for sort of a guiding question, sort of what is the one thing you hope the audience takes home about what we discussed? And if you have any things you'd like to plug or share, this is the time. So maybe we'll start with Reverend Roland.
Thank you again for this opportunity. Again, I have spoken to the various social work classes like once a semester, and it's always a pleasure. So this is always a joy. As I mentioned earlier, you know, our community, MCC Detroit, and we meet at Affirmations, the LGBT Center in Ferndale, on Sundays at 11, just in case anyone is interested. You know, I mentioned that our tagline is bringing spirituality out of the closet, because one of the things that I should have maybe expounded upon is that, you know, coming out is, you know, obviously around your, you know, gender identity or your sexuality is one thing, but sometimes those of us who are, you know, religious people have to come out around our spirituality, especially when you are in queer spaces, when you're around people who have been victims of spiritual violence. And he's like, I don't want to hear anything about religion or God, or, you know, and again, that's quite understandable. So then you tend to be mum when it comes to your own religious convictions and so forth. But I want to tie that tagline, bringing spirituality or bringing your spirituality out of the closet, with what I said earlier about the importance of holistic health, mind, body, and spirit. That you know, just like any, you know, three-legged stool, if you remove one of the legs, you're going to topple over. And those of you who are community caregivers, and if you're a social worker, you are a community caregiver, you know, you owe it to yourself to make sure that you are caring for yourselves in those various ways. And finding spiritual resources is vital. Does not mean you have to go to a church or even read a sacred text, but that you are finding a way that feeds and nurtures your spirit. and being, whether it's one person or many, as we said in already, my fellow panelists have said, when you're trying to build community, that it is good to have someone who you can, bounce those deep, kind of philosophical questions off of about, life and death and, and just how we treat one another. So it's very, very important. So thank you again for this opportunity to share.
Thank you. Ren, do you want to go next?
Sure, I can go next. I think that everybody is deserving of love, unless you're like a Nazi or something along those lines. That's the first thing I want to say. I think that we should just all agree on that. Know your boundaries, express them, and something my brother told me a while ago that was really helpful. It was around the time that things in Syria started to get really bad years ago. And, as a Palestinian, I grew up watching violence on TV all the time. It was just my reality. Watching 9/11 happen when I was very young, it was like, oh, another explosion, and growing up realizing, oh, okay, none of this is normal, I think something I want to say is that it's really important to perspective shift in that regard. And in terms of being able to come to peace with some of these things, it's not always a peaceful process. And if I could say anything just on the topic of social work to the social worker that, for whatever reasons was unable to help me when I needed that sort of help, just listen to the person who has the least power. You could change some lives that way. And there was something else I was going to say, but I forgot. Right, the thing my brother told me. So I was just sitting there and I was like, what am I gonna do? As much as I'd seen growing up, this felt like terrible, right? Because I was now in this point in my life, my 20s, where I was like, oh my gosh, like I had the full brain to process everything and I still couldn't. And he said to me can you change anything about what's going on over there? Can you go help any of those children that you can't get out of your head that need help and are just, going through this terrible thing? And I said, I can't. And he said, and at the time I was working at a donut shop. And he said to me, all you can do is make the best donut that you can make and serve it with the best smile that you have and hope that that creates a ripple in the world. So as much as we feel powerless, remember that every action you take does have impact. And thank you. This was a pleasure.
Thank you, Ren. Daniel?
Yeah, I think something that just came up for me that I didn't quite think of at the beginning is that leaning into religious discussions with my clients who have strong faith, it has made for a much richer practice. So for anyone out there who is in practice with doing therapy or wants to go in that direction, there's a lot to be mined there in terms of motivational interviewing and especially values work. So it's definitely deepened my practice in a way that I'm really appreciative of. I don't have the same faith perspective as them, but I'm learning that language. And I think it also helps to really build rapport. And I don't feel inauthentic. I don't feel like I'm pretending to have their religion. It's just, we keep it sort of broad, but it's become really lovely. I want to thank Judith Weinman, Professor Weinman, who really kind of got this ball rolling because we name dropped her on our podcast. in the first season, and I alerted her to this fact, and then she was like, you have to talk to these students who have this organization, and you're all going to come and do something fabulous. And she got us all together, because that's what she does. She is magic. So thank you, Professor Weinman. And I also just want to invite so on the podcast, we are, we do Bible chapter recaps, but we are now starting a new, every few episodes, a new segment that Rachel has named Chattykism, where we are meeting with queer people of faith or of no faith, and talking with them. So I would love to have any or all of the other panelists at some point on the podcast. So you'll be hearing from us. Other than that, thank you, everybody. This has been fantastic.
Thanks, Jan. Rachel?
Yeah, I am gonna reflect everyone's sentiment of just how happy I am to be here and how amazing it is to get together and have this conversation. Listen to our podcast, please. And also, last thing, if you are an ally, if you're going, for all of our social workers who are just about to graduate, if you're going to work with other human beings, advertise that you're a queer ally. I can't tell you how many people walk into my office and say, oh my gosh, I have been looking so long for an affirming therapist. And that never gets old to me. I know it's a problem. I wish that wasn't what they were saying, but I always feel really, really honored to have that person in my office and to be that safe space for them. So, if you're comfortable and if you can, be out, let people know. And thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. Mark?
So I'm not sure this is like my takeaway point, but it is the thing that I feel I will regret not having said if I don't say it. So Kes, you brought up earlier how so many of the anti-LGBTQ laws right now are targeted specifically at trans people. So mostly today we've talked about the queer community or the LGBTQ community. But I just want to sort of acknowledge the way in which the culture wars have really, really turned against trans people. And so just as Ren was talking earlier about how we can ask of cis straight people to sort of like take on some allyship burdens, I think within the queer community, I'm a cis person, I want to be an ally to trans people. And I think, so that's a challenge I'm going to take on for myself to try to be a better ally there, even within the community. And, others can choose to take on it as well if they would like. But thank you all very much. This has been such a good conversation. It's really nice to have a group of people take both queerness and spirituality and religion so seriously and to put them all together in conversation.
Thank you. I just want to thank everyone who attended today and shared questions. I want to offer that the Queer Social Work Student Alliance, that we are happy, I'm acting like I'm part of it. I know we have talked in the past that it would be great. We know this was a really, for me, I felt emotional during this conversation. I think for a lot of people, this was an emotional conversation. So please reach out to Kristen and Tina so that they can organize a follow-up conversation about this to process some more of this. And I'm happy to help also facilitate such a circle. So please reach out because there's more support, and this is the beginning of a longer conversation that we all have and building that community. I want to wish everyone a blessed Ramadan, and of course Passover and Easter. Holy Week are coming quite soon. So many religious people are worshiping and celebrating right now. So I want to wish you all a great holy time. And thank you all for participating. It was very special. So thank you.
Thank you for putting it together. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.